This video had the weirdest trajectory. Much like Still Wakes the Deep's central antagonist, it kept unexpectedly shifting into ever new shapes and forms, completely different to what I had initially planned for it, almost cancerously growing larger, weirder, more convoluted, and now that I've finished it, I'm legit incredulous at how this strange beast even came together. My first contact with Still Wakes the Deep was a trailer released a couple months back, and I remember being pretty much instantly sold on it. I've always had a big fondness for the Chinese Rooms games pretty much from the earliest days of Half-Life 2 modding, and the premise of a Lovecraftian, narrative-rich, first-person, psychological horror game set on an oil rig in the cold and unrelenting North Sea that I glimpse every day from my office window, set in the 70s with a heaping helping of retro tech porn. It just feels so much up my alley that it was a no-brainer for me to at least play it when it would come out. So once it did come out, I played it through to the end within like 2 afternoons, and already while playing felt so strongly about the whole package that I really craved talking about it. So I made the snap decision to put all my other projects to the side for a spell to channel that excitement into writing about it. At least a short little review or something, because I just really wanted people to know about it. That was the plan. But like, the more I worked on it, replayed it, the more I discovered about it, and the more I put its quite open to interpretation narrative together in my head, the more I felt like I just can't. As in, I just can't contain myself to writing only a quick little review about it. For one, there are already a couple of people who have covered this game with video essays and reviews that beautifully expressed a good part of what I would have wanted to convey in such a review like that myself, and more. Of course, there'd be nothing wrong with me adding my voice to the choir, so deciding against doing a review on it wasn't a case of inferiority complex, but rather I found it kind of liberating. The fact that others had already done that work, and exceedingly well at that, meant that I could focus my energies on other things instead, like drilling a bit deeper into the game's narrative core of what I consider to be the Chinese Room's absurdist horror masterpiece. Now, when I say masterpiece, I mean that in a quite literal sense. In modern parlance, we call something a masterpiece to convey, this thing is really, really good in a slightly more fancy way. But hey, I think it absolutely is. Still Wakes the Deep is, in my personal opinion, really, really good. But that's also a pretty worthless statement. Good is in the eye of the beholder, and I don't really like using good or bad as adjectives to describe video games, or art in general, because it doesn't really say anything. A masterpiece historically refers to a piece of work of an apprentice or journeyman aspiring to become a master craftsman, and that work ideally combines all the skills, techniques, and methodologies of the craft they've learned and honed over the course of their apprenticeship. And that is, in essence, what Still Wakes the Deep is to me. The apotheosis of the Chinese Room's oeuvre established over the past 17 years of the studio's extremely unique history. I will pivot back to this point later in this video, in fact several times even, because this masterpiece metaphor holds water in more than just one way. For now, let's look at it from a purely mechanical/game design point of view. And just for clarity, when I speak of the Chinese Room's lineup of past games in the context of this video, I will focus on their first-person, narrative-centric games and exclude both the VR titles So Let Us Melt for personal lack of VR access and their 2.5D platformer Little Orpheus. I have no experience with either of them, but if you have and think they actually add even more validity to the points I'm trying to make in this video, please fire away in the comments. Let's start with Dear Esther. Originally a Half-Life 2 mod, later turned standalone game, which is a narrative-centric, first-person exploration whose central mechanic is the traversal of a forlorn Hebridean island and the gradual uncovering of a backstory told through fragmented voiceover pieces through which no conclusions or interpretations are offered, confirmed, or denied on purpose. You're incentivized to find your own meaning. An often overlooked title, Korsakovia, equally a single-player Half-Life 2 mod released in 2009, is a first-person survival horror game telling a non-linear story through the fragmented, corrupted memories and delusions of a person suffering from Korsakoff syndrome, a neurological disorder characterized by retrograde amnesia, memory deficits, and confabulation. Story bits are revealed in a non-linear fashion through exploration, diegetic world building, and voiceover narration bits. No conclusions or interpretations are offered, confirmed, or denied on purpose. You're incentivized to find your own meaning. In 2013, the Chinese Room released the indirect sequel to the first-person horror cult hit Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Originally intended as a standalone mod of the original, it was ultimately produced and published by Frictional Games themselves. Amnesia: A Machine for Pigs is a narrative-centric, first-person, defenseless survival horror game that incorporates many of the mechanics of its predecessor, such as an unrelenting, indestructible stalker-type antagonist, sanity mechanics, and a defenseless protagonist. No conclusions or interpretations are offered, confirmed, or denied on purpose. You're incentivized to find your own meaning. In 2015 came Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, a first-person, narrative-focused exploration game in which players explore a small English village in which every person seems to have vanished into thin air from one moment to the next. Players freely roam through the environment and try to deduct what happened through observation of meticulous environmental storytelling and by triggering fragmented mementos of the inhabitants from before the incident. No conclusions or interpretations are offered, confirmed, or denied on purpose. You're incentivized to find your own meaning. Now, if we take all of these, toss it in a Blendtec Total Blender, and push the smoothie button, what we get is Still Wakes the Deep. Don't breathe this. Well, kinda, sorta. My point is not that Still Wakes the Deep is the linear algebraic addition result of the Chinese Room's previous games, but rather that the reason why a game like Still Wakes the Deep ended up being what it is, and especially why it's exceedingly competent in what it tries to achieve on many different levels, the result of everything that came before, themes, craft, experimentation, and respective successes and failures, all of this can be felt in every fiber of Still Wakes the Deep. What I want to do with this video is look at the many facets of this game, what it does, why it does certain things the way it does, and how it's incredibly deliberate and smart in the choices it makes, and from my personal viewpoint, what it actually means. Or rather, why it, once it clicked for me, absolutely blew my mind in a way that my epiphanies with the game's story and themes completely transformed it for me. I won't be able to play it with the same eyes anymore that I first played it with. No hyperbole or exaggeration. And also why I think that Still Wakes the Deep being described as Lovecraftian pretty much unanimously is lacking. It's not wrong per se, but it's too superficial, too bland a descriptor. Why calling it Lovecraftian doesn't drill deep enough. But we'll get to that. Before we start waxing philosophic and get all pretentious about it, before we dissect its fleshy innards and cook it into a delicious metaphysical lasagna, let's make sure that we're all on the same page here. That is, those who've already played the game, those who haven't but maybe have some idea of what it's about, and those, the real MVPs, the ones that see this video's thumbnail on their front page and go, "Honey, wake up, Ragnar just released a lengthy video essay in which he pretentiously overanalyzes a philosophical horror game that I'll never play for myself, and I'm all here for the info dump. Let's go." Oh no! All of you are cherished and loved and welcome. Just be aware that I'm not gonna hold back on the spoilers in this one. By the end of this video, I'll have flown over many of the game's narrative beats until the very end, so if you haven't played it and would like to experience it unspoiled and unbiased, ye be warned. Before we continue, I want to give thanks to NordVPN for sponsoring this video. I believe at this point in time, most people are aware of the general idea of a VPN, but I really want to take the time here to break down what a VPN actually does and why I think it's absolutely invaluable in today's online space to always have access to a good VPN service. Every time you do anything on the internet, your device requests data packages from your internet provider. Hey ISP, get me the data for this specific site, email, torrent, anything really. And they resolve that request and send you the data back. Thing is, these requests are completely transparent to outside eyes, and your ISP shamelessly logs every single one of them indefinitely, millions of them, and makes it all openly available for governments to comb through at will, to keep track of and profile your every action. When you use a VPN like NordVPN, your device instead sends heavily encrypted requests to your ISP that don't get the data directly, but only ever ask to get data from NordVPN. No ISP or government can see what it is that you're requesting from them, and it's Nord's servers, located in over 100 countries across the world, that resolve the data request your device wants instead of your ISP. So your ISP, government, and anyone who's interested in prying can only see this user requested some unreadable, because encrypted, data from Nord. The beauty is that NordVPN servers run on RAM only, exclusively temporary storage, which means that no data package nor request ever gets permanently stored anywhere. So even if a government comes and wants to subpoena data from them, no dice, because it doesn't exist. I've been relying on NordVPN for years now and find it fast, reliable, and customizable to my needs as a heavy PC user. Give it a try. You have a risk-free 30-day trial period in case you find it's not for you, and as a special offer through my partnership with NordVPN, you can get 4 months extra on a 2-year plan if you use the URL nordvpn.com/Ragnar. You can find a link in the description too. So thanks a lot again to NordVPN, and now I hope you enjoyed the rest of the video. Still Wakes the Deep is really, in many ways, the quintessential The Chinese Room game to me. Stripped down to its barest mechanical foundation, it's a first-person, narrative-centric horror game with a defenseless protagonist in the best tradition of genre progenitors like Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Or, if we want to go antediluvian, it was actually Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines who did this exact style of haunted house horror first, with its iconic Ocean House Hotel level, where players are stripped of any means to defend themselves while traversing a largely linear, scripted haunted house scenario with unvanquishable stalker foes at the player's heels. Thinking about it, this lineage couldn't be more fitting, considering that the Chinese Room developed Amnesia's sequel A Machine for Pigs, and is currently the studio in charge of taking over the sequel to no other game than Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, after Paradox Interactive gave the original dev team Hardsuit Labs the boot for still largely undisclosed reasons back in 2021. Still Wakes the Deep takes place on an oil drilling rig in the stormy North Sea of the coast of Scotland in 1975. Players assume the role of Cameron Cass McLeary, who signs up as an electrician, as we find out, to run from a prison sentence on the mainland, as he's wanted by the Scottish police for a non-further specified violent altercation in his past. Through his eyes, we explore the platform, a colossal prison of steel in the middle of the ocean, whose corridors, gangways, machinery, and quarters have been crafted and rendered with an incredible attention to detail. It's an uninviting, borderline inhospitable place to live, but the people on board do their best to turn it into a home wherever they can, adding human warmth and community by carving out little pockets of comfort.
Man, I hope there's some leftovers.
The opening chapter alone, in which we traverse from Cass's room in the crew quarters to the cantina, is so incredibly rich with lavish environmental storytelling that you can easily spend half an hour alone looking, searching, prying through, and inspecting all the rooms, reading letters and all kinds of correspondence, and taking in photos and all kinds of personal mementos, tchotchkes, trinkets, and doodads across the crew quarters, cantina, common room, and all the little nooks and crannies in between that paints a detailed and complex picture of the game's cast before we even meet them. The story's events take place during the Christmas holidays, so the rig is at the time operating with a skeleton crew, which makes the comparably small set of characters we encounter across the game way more manageable to learn about, as well as makes the setting feel more authentic without the devs having to craft a regular army of largely faceless NPCs. Instead, each person we encounter feels like a surprisingly fleshed out person, with an individual backstory, personal relations, dreams, fears, motivations, mannerisms, speech patterns, political views, you name it. The station feels incredibly alive, which is only further supported by the lifelike acting and voice acting of the game's cast, one of the most unanimously praised aspects about this game. Authentic regional dialects, colloquialisms, delightfully heavy swearing, and a rich pastiche of very human mannerisms in the game's cast paint a rich and especially extremely convincing picture of a set of people working on an oil rig in the Scottish oil boom era of the 1970s, a time when the frantic North Sea oil fever sparked a turbulent period of socio-political turmoil with the aspired hope to lift the recession-plagued Scottish populace from an ongoing economic crisis. There's so much depth to the storytelling, hidden in conversational nuance and diegetic storytelling like letters, correspondence, and other bits of rich characterization scattered almost everywhere that it's near impossible to get the full picture during your first playthrough. There's a ton I didn't spot at first, and it really needed me to go through it again with more context after playing through it for the first time. Like how Cass, for instance, when reading through pro-union correspondence, privately leaves supportive remarks about unionization, but when pressed in conversations with his co-workers, reacts carefully reserved, which implies he's aware of how hot and potentially dangerous it could be to share his views openly during this time, and it gives a whole nother layer to it when you consider that his reservation is likely also strongly motivated by him trying to keep a low profile given his status as a fugitive of the law, something almost nobody here on the platform knows about.
Workers of the world unite! What do you think, Kaz?
I don't know. Just here to fix the lecky.
And he never explicitly says that, his actions just make sense. There is one person on board, though, who knows Cass better than anyone, and that's his close friend and godfather of his children, Roy, who works as a cook on board the rig. And their conversations over the course of the game are some of the most authentically human and also at times heartbreaking I've witnessed two characters in a video game have, like, ever.
You won't leave me. It's bloody terrifying out there.
I'm not leaving you,
I
pal.
wouldn't blame you if you did, mate.
I mean, you've got all the food in here for a start.
I'm gonna come back to that a little bit later. But despite all the wholesome character exposition, Still Wakes the Deep is, of course, not a life on oil rig simulator, so before long, something has to go awry.
Well, here we fucking go.
Not only does Cass' extremely hot-headed boss find out about his legal dilemma with the po-po on the mainland and fires him amidst a torrent of shouting and cussing up in his office, which already sucks, but while Cass is on his way to the helipad to leave the platform for good, a terrible catastrophe is about to unfold. I kept thinking about the game's choice of setting for its sort of nature retaliates man's greed central narrative, and I'd be extremely surprised if the famous Piper Alpha disaster that occurred off the coast of Scotland in 1988 hadn't served as a huge thematic influence for the game's events. 165 people lost their lives, and around 670 tons of oil were spilled straight into the ocean, making it one of the ecologically and economically costliest man-made catastrophes ever recorded, often dubbed the Chernobyl of big oil. The Piper Alpha incident was caused by inadequate maintenance and safety procedures in favor of faster production turnarounds to maximize profits. Faster, harder, fuck regulations, drill the earth dry. We make money here. The catastrophe in Still Wakes the Deep is very similarly rooted in man's relentless pursuit to subjugate nature with brute force of technology while throwing all safety precautions overboard against better judgment. And, albeit in a slightly more eldritch and a lot more allegorical turn of events, nature retaliating. Right from the get-go, we see left and right that the place is in utter disrepair, and management doesn't care and tries to penny pinch and downsize wherever they can, knowingly sacrificing safety and security of the staff and the infrastructure in order to maximize profit margins.
Stay in this place.
We witness radio and loudspeaker communications between the drilling team that tries to warn the executives that something doesn't feel right, strongly advising caution, but it's straight up overruled in the opening segment of the game. And in doing so, the Beira-D ends up stirring an ancient power deep beneath the ocean waves, waking it from a slumber that might have lasted for eons. An antediluvian force that is about to slither and claw its way back to the surface. Anywhere and everywhere, things start shaking, things start breaking aboard the Beira-D, left and right, above and beyond, and before long, Kaz finds himself in a frantic and exhausting fight for survival, with every inch of the platform becoming a death trap. He's fighting harsh weather, environmental hazards brought about by a utilitarian construction of steel and concrete coming undone amidst the roiling and uncaring ocean, and, if that wasn't enough already, the venereal invasion of a gargantuan organic entity of bioluminescent flesh and tendrils that penetrates, permeates, and outright consumes the entire infrastructure of the Beira-D inch by inch. There are a ton of movies and video games Still Wakes the Deep gets frequently compared to, but for some reason the one I thought of that amused me the most was it feels kinda like a Die Hard on an oil rig.
Come out to the coast, we'll get together, have a few laughs.
Kaz is the outsider tossed into a perilous struggle for survival aboard a place that there's no escaping from. So his choices are reduced to simply giving up and dying, or fighting tooth and nail in the face of overwhelming odds. Only that it's not terrorists, but an ancient eldritch organism that takes the oil rig and its unassuming population hostage. Well, a bit more than just that. Oh yeah, and Kaz doesn't ho have a machine gun, or any weapon for that matter. For large parts of the game, we're merely wrestling with the dangers brought about by the environment itself amidst ongoing destruction, and we climb, sidle, and parkour our way out of a seemingly never-ending onslaught of deadly situations and ever onward to the next objective, trying to regain some semblance of control over its incurring catastrophe. When I say parkour, I want to clarify that this is not an Assassin's Creed, where you just hold a button and yank the thumbstick forward to make the protagonist weasel their way effortlessly up and along any surface. In Still Wakes the Deep, we have to be more deliberate about our movements and actions, and can easily fall to our death, get crushed, burned, drowned, or electrocuted at a moment's notice if we're not careful. And whenever Kaz loses his grip or footing, holding on is a deliberate player input. You have to actively want to keep going. I love how authentic and believable the game makes traversal and interfacing with the environment feel. Operating heavy levers, doors, winches, wheels and valves, big machinery has substance. It feels like things, including the character you embody himself, feel weighty. All the technological terminals, apparatuses, devices, controls we come across and not infrequently have to operate are time-appropriately chunky and feel satisfyingly haptic, and Kaz regularly comments on and reacts to his environment with a wide and expressively authentic feeling repertoire of comments, exclamations, swears, and other expletives whenever it feels contextually appropriate.
What the fuck was that?
I don't know, but the generators are that way.
Well, I'm no fucking going in there.
Have you got a better plan?
For instance, whenever we come in contact with, or even have to fully submerge ourselves into the icy North Sea waters, the game doesn't just ignore the fact that this would put anyone in serious and immediate danger of hypothermia. He audibly winces, cusses, shivers, his teeth start shattering, he hyperventilates, and he will outright refuse to proceed until he's found a heat source for him to get some warmth back into him first. All these little things add to the environment and, respectively, our protagonist, the game world we inhabit, feeling lifelike and authentic, which massively helps suspension of disbelief. But of course, aside from the environment, there's still the central horror antagonist we haven't even talked about yet. The amorphous and invasive organism that overtakes the rig. I'm gonna call it the Shape from here on out, as that's how it's named in the game's wiki pages, so it will stay in line with the official lore. A writhing and slithering biomass that pierces its way not just into every niche and crevice of the platform, but, as we find out, into the people themselves as well. At first, we only witness weird, organic shapes crawling their way into the rig from a distance, quite incredulous and dumbfounded. And then as we carry on, we encounter more and more devastation wrought about by the invading organism, and realize that as we come closer to it, it seems to have an almost hallucinogenic effect, blurring our field of view and giving us vivid visions and perception lapses. The game really takes its time to gradually expose us to more intense and dire situations with the alien entity. Like in a hectic chase sequence down the flooded corridors of one of the rig's legs, we rush through the darkness only equipped with a flashlight while we're overwhelmed by an incredibly intense and adrenaline-inducing soundscape of reverberating screams and snarls and cries of agony that seem to be always right behind us and everywhere all at once. We We come across dead people and hear others in the distance grunt and scream in ways that seem bestial, primal, not quite human anymore. It's a good, spine-chilling slow burn supported by incredibly claustrophobic environments and absolutely stellar horror sound design that carries us through the first hour of the game until we ultimately face the entity itself for the first time. But this is the gut-churning part of it. Once we get into our first fight-or-flight face-to-face bout with the shape, it's not just some strange tentacles or anything else as abstract as that's coming for us, but it's other crew members who the shape has claimed and seemingly taken control over, transformed, mutated, and outright subsumed into its fleshy, shapeless organism, who hunt us with a blood-curdling ferocity that really took me by surprise.
What the fuck?
Whenever we find ourselves in an encounter with a taken crew member, we have to be careful, quiet, methodical, avoid confrontation and detection at all costs, keep a good sense of spatial awareness, and use every means available to keep them off our trail. Picking up scattered objects and tossing them around for distraction, quietly sneaking about and avoiding light sources, and sometimes just hightailing away from our pursuer as fast as humanly possible within a claustrophobic steel contraption where every inch has to be stuffed full of utility as chock-full as possible. The closest and most accurate comparison for these segments, gameplay and also design-wise, I could think of was Alien Isolation. The chunky, old-time 70s technological feel of the environments and how encounters with the xenomorph feel aboard Sevastopol Station. I personally find the encounters already on its own, just in the way they're presented and play out, aside from just a handful of janky behaviors of throwable objects, extremely engaging and engrossing to play. But narratively, there's a truly gut-churning body horror layer to the way the shape operates, as it starts dawning on the player that the people that have been taken by the shape don't just get killed by it, but outright assimilated to morph into the organism. It forcefully invades its victims, penetrates and perverts them, transmogrifying them into grotesque flesh abominations of their former selves. Still Wakes the Deep is an amazing example of the fridge horror trope. Fridge horror is, simply put, when something becomes terrifying after the fact. Something you take note of only superficially at first, or not at all, but then the more you think about it later down the line, potentially while not even engaging with the media itself, you realize something about it you hadn't put together before, and out of nowhere it turns into absolute nightmare fuel. This game is filled to the brim with fridge horror. One example for this is what I've already been dipping our noses into, the whole design and concept behind the game's antagonistic shape organism that hits especially hard when you've spent a lot of time familiarizing yourself with the crew members and have internalized all the many little bits of intricate character building the game has scattered about for players to discover and digest. Because those that have been invaded and transformed by the shape are now hunting for us with carnal aggression, seemingly mind-controlled, but they're still in there. They're still alive, they're still conscious and clearly feeling. You can hear from the things they utter when they feel unobserved, and from the things they scream and shout at us when they're hunting us down.
Fuck. Oh dear. Jesus.
Notions, utterances, and exclamations clearly based on their personality, their memories, fears, insecurities, but grotesquely distorted into monstrous contortions, where they still seem to fully feel their sense of being, their sense of self bleeding away, being absorbed into some insatiable, greater parasitic or symbiotic conscience. There was something that I didn't fully realize at first, because we get initially only exposed to our assimilated crewmates and their exclamations and utterings exclusively in situations of extreme stress, when you have them right at your heels and the insanely intimidating sound design gets your adrenaline pumping hard. Like, side note here, but when it comes to scare factor in horror games, I've been pretty stoic when faced with startling screamer content in media for quite a long time. Most jump scares honestly barely get a reaction out of me, and that's no tough guy bragging or anything, it's really just how it is. Weirdly anhedonic about this stuff, which I sometimes find quite disappointing even. I'd love to be way more receptive to shocky content. But this game, seriously, especially during the first hours, it really got my blood pumping multiple times, not gonna lie. But hey, just if this is something you personally really can't stomach, Still Wakes the Deep actually comes with pretty great accessibility options, including the option to turn enemy encounters off, making it a story-only mode, which I highly appreciate. Very similar to the later added story mode for Soma, where it was a fantastic addition to the game, because both Soma and Still Wakes the Deep, the story and the many things it has hidden in its narrative and world building for players to unfridge, in my opinion, they're the true deep-piercing horror these games have to offer, not the immediate encounters. Anyway, those are the adversaries we face in Still Wakes the Deep. Our former colleagues now perverted into some unfathomable alien life form. Once I realized this, the fact that each monster we face and have to deal with is actually, not even just some rando, but a very specific character on board the platform, someone we've met before, that we could learn about before, and while they're hunting us, they're in the process of being transformed by this eldritch flesh being, and the stuff they spout all lines up with their characterizations, the things we read about them and learned about them in conversations before and other interactions beforehand. It really gave me the chills, man. And the absolute beauty of it was that it happened neither in a hectic combat evasion situation, nor in a, now listen up, dear player, I'm gonna lore dump exposition on you and do the thinking for you situation, but in a moment of calm contemplation when I was passively processing the things I had witnessed before. Fridge horror. As I said, Still Wakes the Deep is full of this, and this is just one of the most open examples. And I can say that the biggest oh shit revelation for me was so intense that it made me replay the entire game immediately and see it with completely different eyes. Pure absurdist horror of the finest cut. But I'm working my way towards that point, so stay with me. As I said before, one very important aspect of the Shape's nature is that Cass, our protagonist himself, is not immune to its attempts at mind assault. Whenever he comes in contact with it or gets too closely exposed to its gooey innards, his vision gets distorted by this postulating overlay, and sometimes his consciousness finds himself pulled into abject hallucinative dioramas in which he seems to relive some of his most emotionally loaded memories. While the more obvious, immediate threat imposed by the Shape is of a physical nature, the threat of injury, of direct violence and destruction of the body, the far more sinister threat are the implications of the violation, transformation, and ultimately the complete absorption of its victim's very identity.
What do you know about oil rings, you roaster?
Good with the lecking.
So at this point you're probably thinking, the fuck was that earlier about the game not being Lovecraftian? This sounds pretty darn Lovecraftian to me. It even has tentacles and shit. Well, yeah, I mean, it is, and I never said that the game isn't Lovecraftian. Everything is Lovecraftian these days, but what does that even say at this point? Lovecraftian as a descriptor for horror has become so ubiquitous and overused that it really doesn't convey much at all anymore. Describing Still Wakes the Deep as Lovecraftian horror is a bit like if you had lasagna for lunch and someone asks you, "Oh, what did you have for lunch?" And you say, "Oh, I had European food today." Lovecraftian at this point in time can be anything that has any semblance of terrible situations brought about by something inexplicable that feels greater than man, or anything that has vibes of impending doom, or just tentacles, no matter how far it strays from the overall tone and narrative direction of the works of H.P. Lovecraft himself. Ancient beings older than time itself, to whom the existence of mortals is more insignificant than a single ant within a massive colony is to the average human, stampeding over our existential dread-filled lives and all that jazz. And yeah, There are definitely some strong tonal and thematic overlaps in Still Wakes the Deep, no question, but if you ask me, it also doesn't really convey the core of the game's narrative at all. It's a European lasagna. And yeah, even the publisher markets the game as Lovecraftian horror, which makes sense, I guess, because it's probably way less punchy in trailers and on ad posters to bang the drum for Chinese Room's newest Cronenbergian horror thriller. Still Wakes the Deep's devs are quite open about the many literary, cinematic, and ludic inspirations they took for its setting and story, and one of the most front and center ones is John Carpenter's The Thing from 1982. A movie about a bunch of people stuck in an Arctic research station that gets infested by a parasitic alien life form that invades and takes control of human victims who in turn become violent in the process and eventually mutate into grotesque fleshy abominations while still retaining a kernel of the original host's identity, character, personality, memories, thoughts, and feelings. Is this movie Lovecraftian? Yeah, sure, I guess. Like lasagna is a European dish. But just like with Still Wakes the Deep, the Lovecraftian moniker here doesn't really quite hit the poodle's core, as they say in Germany. See, arguably out of Carpenter's entire filmography, The Thing is by far his most Cronenbergian movie of all of them. And I really hope the man doesn't see this and end up getting mad at me for saying this.
I think the night that got me was David Cronenberg showed up, and he's an old friend of mine. And unfortunately, he takes himself so seriously these days. He's an artist now. And literally, he was holding court in the middle of the room, so I came over to talk to him. And he didn't even look at me. And I thought, there's enough of this. Forget it. Goodbye. I walked out. I don't need this anymore.
Conversely, what I kept thinking when playing Still Wakes the Deep over and over again was, this feels like I'm playing a David Cronenberg movie. So much so that this was meant to be, for a good while working on this essay, the central point of this video even. Something Still Wakes the Deep is Cronenbergian horror perfection, chef's kiss, mwah. So why does that even matter? What makes a story Cronenbergian, and how does that apply to Still Wakes the Deep? And not just to this game, but really, the closer I looked, to Chinese Room's entire backlog of narrative-centric first-person games. The first thing that usually comes to mind when people think of the Canadian director and screenwriter David Cronenberg is body horror. Active in the film industry since the 1960s, Cronenberg has written and directed a regular murderous row of iconically abject movies. Shivers, Scanners, Videodrome, Dead Ringers, The Brood, and the 1986 adaptation of George Langeland's short story The Fly is just a partial selection of his works that are fueled by his signature style of venereal horror, which makes generous use of lavish practical effects to create impressions of physical abjection, a deep passion for mutation, and an almost fetishistic penchant for the organic, the fleshy, the things that repulse us. But this passion of his doesn't just confine itself to the engrossingly gross. Cronenberg is a director with an incredible range to match and even surpass directors like Ridley Scott or James Cameron in many regards. Being not just the uncrowned king of body horror, he's also capable of pulling off a near-flawless adaptation of Madame Butterfly, a gritty and emotional blood and dust mob flick like Eastern Promises, and to adapt John Wagner's History of Violence into a deeply introspective and personable character meditation on human identity, the body, and their reciprocal relationship to violence. If there's one single through line in the entire body of Cronenberg's works, it's the fluidity of identity. The inherent relationship between the body and a person's identity, and the vulnerability and malleability of this delicate equilibrium. His movies explore how our environments can infect and distort our perception of identity and reality. Physiology, psychology, and environment always inseparably interlinked. You cannot change one without affecting the whole. And through this lens, he routinely explores themes of body dysmorphia, identity conflict, and the loss of our fickle notions of self through physiological and physical deformation and destruction from many different angles. no matter if you watch his earlier, more body horror-focused films, or his more recent prestige films like Eastern Promises or A History of Violence, the human body is always at the center of his attempts at exploring identity. It gets cut, wounded, tattooed, violated, mutated, transformed, perverted. And those changes are never just brought up for mere shock value, but they always directly affect changes in a person's identity or character. Equally, Cronenberg has a unique and relentless approach to violence in his films. Where most filmmakers focus on the immediate, one might say gratifying action of violence as a means to an end, Cronenberg is more concerned with the end itself and what comes after, near obsessively focusing on the effects and repercussions of any form of violence with what feels like an almost sadistic voyeurism. In his own words,
"We've got an audience that's definitely going to applaud these acts of violence, and they do because it's set up that these acts are justifiable and almost heroic at times. But I'm saying, okay, if you can applaud that, can you applaud this? Because this is the result of that gunshot in the head. It's not nice. And even if the violence is justifiable, the consequences of the violence are exactly the same. The body does not know what was the morality of that act. So I'm asking the audience to see if they can contain the whole experience of this violent act instead of just the heroic dramatic one. I'm saying, here's the really nasty effects on these nasty guys, but still, the effects are very nasty. And that's the paradox and conundrum."
One of the key variables in the Cronenberg equation is always environment. Just like a person's identity is inseparably interlinked with the body, that person is by necessity part of and therefore subject to their environment. And in a wide gamut, Cronenberg's movies often very directly explore and reflect our deeply held anxieties about the effects of our environment on us. Disease, abuse, control, oppression, industrialization, technologization, how the frenetic pace of societal change and progress is also fundamentally affecting and changing us as humans, and how the exploitation of these forces of modernity are the breeding soil for our very existential fears, twisting and changing us into something perceived as more than / not quite human anymore. But where does the notion of human start and where does it end? To me, this is the quintessence of Cronenberg's works, immanent critique, the ever-shifting nature of human memory, identity, and experience, how an individual person can be at the mercy of so many different crosswinds of society, technology, progress, and so on, which exposes the very concept of human identity to be an extremely fickle and insubstantial thing indeed, a lightning in a bottle, fraught with enormous possibilities and the deepest, most existential forms of horror. David Cronenberg's movies have polarized audiences and critics alike throughout his entire career, and a big reason for that is that they expose the audience to a tantalizing torrent of absurd impressions, but decidedly never deliver a wrap-it-all-up explanation, never so pretentious as to tell the viewer what they're supposed to think and feel. No conclusions or interpretations are offered, confirmed, or denied on purpose. You're incentivized to find your own meaning. And because of that approach, it's a given that a subset of the audience will always end up leaving theaters frustrated when by the end of it they feel like they don't get it. And instead of just accepting that not immediately understanding or resonating with something on the spot can be a quite enriching experience, give the thumbs down and call it pretentious garbage. Because it can't be that others get it and I don't, that's insulting, so the P-bomb is the only way forward when trying to save face from embarrassment, yada yada. Interestingly, most of the games by the Chinese Room I highlighted in this video received the same subset of negative reception when they came out. Dear Esther, quite famously, was at the front and center of a heated debate on what is even a real game and all that garbage. It was the one for which the derogatory term walking simulator was coined, largely by audiences who did not get it and then did not want to get it and felt insulted by the prospect of a game making you think more than it makes you shoot, by a game that embarrasses you for not, quote-unquote, getting it on the spot. P-bomb. Everybody's Gone to the Rapture widened Dear Esther's piecing together story and interpretation in your head approach to a much grander scope, and while it was praised for its visuals, atmosphere, and voice acting, the largest body of criticism was given for the game's story and message being so convoluted that audiences struggled actually getting it. And A Machine for Pigs is, especially considering the expectations people approached it with as a sequel to the first Amnesia game, maybe the most underrated and misunderstood game in the entirety of the Chinese Room's oeuvre. People are starting to come around on it these days, but largely audiences didn't get it. And Still Wakes the Deep, it was met with an overall exceedingly positive reception, but there's a few points that are regularly criticized, and one of them is a variation on the theme of I don't get it. I.e., the story doesn't explain itself conclusively enough at the end, so players are left with unanswered questions. How is this a basis for criticism even, honestly? I don't get it. But if that was the only correlation between Cronenberg and Still Wakes the Deep, the fact that it leaves things open to the audience's interpretation and that a reliable subset of the audience is going to criticize it for being too vague and not spelling things out for them, then that wouldn't really be worth mentioning it like this front and center, right? In fact, as I mentioned, playing Still Wakes the Deep made me feel like I was in an interactive, first-person David Cronenberg movie, and the further I got in, the more this feeling kept solidifying. It starts out with the obvious, the gross, the disgusting, venereal horror we continuously encounter throughout Cass's odyssey across the Baradi, with the invading shape being this grotesque organism that is clearly alive and likely even sentient, but it feels positively inscrutable in such a grandiose, absurd way, this giant, monstrous entity that consumes both the station's inhabitants as well as the station itself, which feels in many ways like a character in and of itself, and merges them all into itself. But it doesn't just stop with the fleshy grossness that especially Cronenberg's earlier works are so famous for, but particularly when it comes to themes of identity, Still Wakes the Deep is right there. In many ways, that's what The Shape and this whole story is all about: identity. The characters on the station whose very identity is so front and center to the experience of re-encountering them in their corrupted forms, assimilated by the shape both physically and mentally, when its unfathomably vast, amalgamated hive mind bleeds into their consciousnesses and blends them with its own eldritch synaptic system. There it is, front and center, this Cronenberg through line of the fluidity of identity under attack and how it is directly affected by our surroundings, our environment, and when we consider the overarching setting of a dystopian construction exploiting the lifeblood of the earth for profit and the universe retaliating for it, the theme of how an individual person can be at the mercy of so many different crosswinds of society, technology, progress, and so on, which exposes the very concept of human identity to be an extremely fickle and insubstantial thing indeed, a lightning in a bottle, fraught with enormous possibilities and the deepest, most existential forms of horror. And very importantly, identity also plays a pivotal role for the story of Cass, the protagonist himself, him being someone who did a bad thing in the past and fled, and thereby dodged responsibility to own up for his mistakes and leaving his loved ones behind. Now he is faced with a catastrophe of eldritch proportions, a situation that is beyond hopeless, and in the midst of all of this, he ends up not giving up, not shying away from his responsibilities, but instead he faces them and fights tooth and nail with every fiber of his being to eke out the slimmest chance for survival. Not just for himself, but for those that depend on him. Finlay, Brody, and Roy of all people. In the face of overwhelming odds, he develops the responsibility and the courage to become what he should have been back before he left the mainland. But despite his newfound penchant for heroism, every single soul that Cass interacts with on his journey gets inexorably claimed by the Shape or perishes and then gets claimed. And no matter how hard he tries and fights and clings to life, he is and remains utterly oblivious and powerless in the face of something too grand, too absurd for him or anyone on board to fathom, let alone fight. And even his best friend Roy, who is scared shitless in dire medical distress from the moment the invasion begins.
Listen, when you get to the chopper, tell Archie to radio in the support ship. We need all the fucking help we can get, Kaz.
All right, big man, all right. Just be careful, okay? My girls need their godfather in one piece.
Ultimately, he could also not help him, no matter how hard he fought.
Roy, don't leave me. I can't do this, man. I'm scared, Roy. I'm fucking terrified. What am I going to tell Susan? Hey.
He was always gonna die. All of them. Always. You see that? We've been fucking about with a lakey and pontoons and without a whole mail. Watching our pals turn into monsters. Never once, never fucking once have we tried to do what needed to be done.
And after everyone else is dead or claimed, or does it even make a difference at this point, Kaz makes his way towards the center of it all, the very kernel of the invading organism that envelops the Bera D's drilling core. The place transformed into a grotesque amalgamation of colossal machinery and gargantuan organic matter that appears like the pulsing inside of the beating heart chamber of a celestial giant. It is paradoxically terrifying and beautiful at the same time. And it is here that Kaz finally understands.
Christ! I never had a chance.
This is it. This is the moment, the one line that crystallizes all this game is about. We never had a chance. In these final moments, Kaz strikes a stormlighter and tosses it into the depths of the drill core, blowing the whole place and everything with it sky high. In the epilogue, we witness him on the day of his departure, in the bedroom where his wife is still asleep, ass early in the morning, and we leave through a doorway that leads out over a roiling oceanscape. The end. The game doesn't explain this. Is Kaz dead, and this is his afterlife/purgatory? Did Kaz actually succeed to destroy the shape in a self-sacrificial final act? I don't know, and I honestly don't think these are very interesting questions at all. So here's a counter question. Was Kaz even alive? Like the whole time? Or was he dead all along? And his time on the Bera D fighting the monstrous invasive eldritch entity was his personal odyssey through his own purgatory. This might seem cliche, but it is not as far-fetched as it might sound. The game's events definitely support this hypothesis. Early in the game, right after Kaz gets fired by his boss and sent to the helipad to return to the mainland, following the very first eruption that shakes the oil rig, his colleague Gregor falls off the platform. Kaz, being close by, rushes to his aid in a desperate attempt to save his life, but it's to no avail, and Kaz himself falls right after him, 40-odd meters down into the cold and unrelenting North Sea midwinter at around 5 degrees Celsius. The odds of surviving this are extremely slim, to say the least. And this is also the first time in the game the shape effect pops up. Those blurry, organic screen distortions that keep flashing little snippets of Kaz's memories before his eyes. They never occurred before, but they keep occurring from that point on, literally flashing his life before his eyes. Kaz wakes up, fished out of the sea by Brody and Douglas, and finds that his colleague Gregor didn't make it. What an insane amount of luck. The thing is, before that point, there was not a single supernatural thing going on. The strange emergence of the shape and its id machine-like transformation of the station, the bizarre violations and transformations of his friends and comrades, and especially the penetration into Kaz's own memories, hopes, and fears, all of this starts unfolding after the fall into the sea that was virtually impossible to survive to begin with.
Fucking hell. losing my mind.
And those friends that do get turned, as we said, they all retain a kernel of their very own personalities that reflects back at us. But what we get are exclusively fractures of the things that only Kaz can know about. The more familiar he is with them, the more intricate they reflect in their shape-distorted forms, as if their perverted forms are subconsciously manufactured by his mind. And everything about his ordeal here, as we said before, is about his biggest regret in life and turning it around. That he didn't have the courage of facing the consequences of his actions and about overcoming it. Growing the courage to take responsibility and fight in the face of impossible odds, something he couldn't do when he was still alive. So now, let us go back to that seminal moment, that grand realization of unavoidability of cosmic fate in the face of the absurd.
Christ, I never had a chance.
When I heard this for the first time, it was clear that this had enormous gravity. It literally gave me goosebumps, even though I couldn't fully process it at once in that moment, and it still took a good bit of fermenting in my mind until it really fell into place for me. The thing about this is, that epiphany that I had about it, and that, as I said, made me not able to look at this game in the same light ever again, this is 100% my personal reading. And just like the Kaz is dead all along hypothesis, I don't know if it's the developer's official canon interpretation, if that's what it was meant to represent in the writer's minds from the get-go. And I honestly don't give a fart. The author is dead, and so are we all. No conclusions or interpretations are offered, confirmed, or denied on purpose. You're incentivized to find your own meaning. The shape is death, an allegory for the very notion of entropy. There it is. We never had a chance. The Chinese Room, with every single one of their narrative-centric games, have always deliberately left things open to interpretation so that you can explore it with your own lens of life experiences, expectations, and biases, and are meant to find your own meaning in them, as I've repeated multiple times in this video already. And what you find might just vary from the next person's take on it drastically, and neither of you would be wrong. That's the beauty. Before I give you my personal reading on that pivotal moment and of Still Wakes the Deep in total, allow me to take you on one last aside in the form of a very personal anecdote. About 8-9 years ago, I had a dear friend of mine over one evening to show him Dear Esther. Now, a little bit about him you should know. He was, at the time, 76 years old, and had been a really pivotal mentor and father figure for me throughout my entire life, and had remained one of my closest friends deep into adulthood. An incredibly kind-hearted, deeply intelligent man to whom I'd looked up for all my life, and for many years we would meet in the evening every other week or so, sip whiskey together, and talk about anything and everything until deep into the night. So one evening, as I said, I invited him over for a little virtual hike across the Hebrides, producing a setting-appropriate bottle of wonderfully peaty 18-year-old Bowmore as provision for our journey, and he absolutely loved it, as did I. We ended up traversing through the whole game twice that evening, and he was so on board, excitedly trying to piece together the game's scattered narrative with me, said it made him feel like Sherlock Holmes. One thing I distinctly remember being really impressed by was how he was able to decipher the structural chemical formulas plastered with luminescent paint across the cave walls on the spot without having to look anything up. Well, he was a natural scientist after all. Anyway, we replayed segments, took notes, and puzzled and discussed potential avenues of interpreting the story for many hours. It was great fun, wonderful memory. then at one point he asked me if we could replay the final chapter of the game and if he could take control of the character for himself. Now, he was not a capital G gamer by any means, intuitively accustomed to controlling a first-person protagonist in a 3D environment. Had never done that before, but I gave him a little crash course and he picked up on it surprisingly quickly. Throughout Dear Esther, you keep following the blinking beacon of a radio tower in the distance, a carrot on a stick that carries you onwards throughout the journey across the nameless island, and towards the end of that last chapter, you ascend the hill towards it. That intangible, faraway light finally starts getting palpably closer and closer, becoming tangible at last, with the game's achingly melancholic background orchestration gradually amping up in intensity. And when you arrive at the hilltop and enter the fenced-off building, the game takes over control and you slowly start ascending the ladder until you arrive all the way at the top of the broadcast antenna. The red flashing light now engulfing you totally, and you walk to the edge and stop to stare down the cliffs and all across the moonlit coast. And then you walk one more step forward and fall. But your fall does not feel right, not as you'd expect, falling the 9.81 meters per second square of Earth's gravity acceleration formula. Instead, you glide downwards, gently, carried by a bizarre weightlessness that shifts that spike of vertigo adrenaline into a feeling of uncanny perplexion. What is happening? Now, one thing I have to mention is that at the time we played this game, my friend had been struggling with heart problems for several years. 2 years prior to our little gaming session, he had been struck by a heart attack. To his fortune, it happened when he and his wife had a friend over who just so happened to be a medical doctor who just so happened to have an emergency defibrillator in his car. His friend succeeded in restarting his heart with CPR and defibrillation after about 5 minutes of complete cardiac arrest. On that evening, we played Dear Esther together. My friend had specifically asked me to replay that final chapter of the game himself, and when you reached the final ascent of the radio tower and the subsequent fall, he told me this. On that day, when his heart had stopped beating for the better part of 5 minutes, he remembers having had an extremely lifelike, lucid dream experience. As he described it, it didn't feel like just a short moment, but time itself had become stretched, unnaturally distorted. He said it could have been hours, days, weeks during which he felt suspended in midair, falling but not falling towards any ground, not feeling threatened or endangered, but oddly serene, weightless, and completely at peace. He said that he had never talked about this with anyone up until this point, but that the sequence gave him shivers all over his body because it brought it all back in an instant. And the exact moment, the single beat that did it, was this. My friend sat there, that 2-meter-tall mountain of a man, visibly moved to tears, and said to me, I really don't know if that's what the people who made this game intended with this, but this is exactly how my dream back then felt. My friend Hartmut passed away from cardiac arrest a little less than a year after that. I miss him pretty much every day, and pretty much every time I think of him, I wonder if, on the day he passed, he was back in that lucid dreamscape he described, free of every worry and every burden, soaring weightlessly across a cerebral tapestry woven from the dreams and memories accrued over his lifetime. Who knows? Is this what the Chinese room had in mind when they implemented this final sequence into Dear Esther? Was it meant to resemble what you could call a near-death lucid dream experience? It would certainly fit the themes of a man who tries to come to terms with the death of his wife in his purgatorial hiking trek, but who knows? It's never explicitly explained. And does it really matter? Because it means, and it will forever immutably mean this to me, personally, even if every single person who worked on the game one day knocked on my door and told me, "No, Ragnar, you're wrong. That is not what it means." Nah, that's never gonna happen. That'd go against everything these games are about. The beauty of how Still Wakes the Deep tells its story is that it works both when you take what happens completely literal, as well as if you look at it as a grand allegory for the absurdist nature of life and the inevitability of our own mortality without any of these interfering with or cancelling out each other. On the surface, what we're experiencing is a seemingly supernatural life force invading a remote oil rig in the deep sea and killing off its inhabitants with brutal primordial violence, while we fight against all odds for survival alongside our crewmates until we come to the realization that we never stood a chance to make it in the first place, and the only option we're left with is to suicide bomb the whole compound sky high in order to prevent the shape and its infectious spread from ever reaching the mainland. Take one for the team. But when we flip the coin and look at it as a psychological horror narrative, that it also advertises itself as, by the way, in the best tradition of Cronenbergian venereal identity horror that seamlessly blends reality and hallucination until we're purposefully left in the dark of what's real and what's imagination, then it becomes increasingly apparent that barely anything in this game is here by chance, even or especially the stuff that the game has been criticized for. Kaz is going through a form of purgatory, and surviving it was never the goal, but rather coming to terms with his regrets, his fears, and his inexorable mortality, and that of everyone around him. And there is quite literally no escape. From the start, or no, rather from the moment Kaz wakes up after having fallen into the ocean from 120 feet, every attempt at escaping this hellscape by anyone fails under the most dubious of circumstances. Lifeboats mysteriously crash into the sea, and the helicopter that attempts to fly away with Rennick on board for no particular reason at all can't get away and miraculously turns around as if it flew straight into an invisible force field and then subsequently crashes. You can't escape the shape because you can't escape what the shape is. Should I really? Ah, fuck it. The seemingly evil monstrosity that invades, penetrates, permeates, assimilates, and subsumes the lives of everyone around us. It's such a terrifying antagonistic force, and yet it has no malice. It just is. Everyone on the station eventually falls prey to it one way or another, and the shape will claim them, and it will make them part of itself. The shape feeds on life in every shape and form and absorbs it into its seemingly parasitic organism to amalgamate into something grander, sentient, terrible, and beautiful in a grotesque way that the individual that's being subjected to it is incapable to fathom. Just like how a blood cell has no concept of the greater organism it is part of. Just like how every soul on board the Bear-A-D is part of the organism that the oil rig consists of. Just like how every living thing in the universe, every person and every animal and every plant and every leaf on every tree and every cell in every body eventually dies, disintegrates, and becomes one with everything again. Everything is in free fall all the time, and we're not wired to cope with that, and so we pretend it isn't happening, but it is. From the moment we come into this world, we are clinging to anything that gives us the illusion of stability, that makes us pretend we stand on solid ground. We cling to dogma, ideology, principle, religion, philosophy, in order to hold on to something that makes us forget this notion. that we're falling. But anything we cling to is nothing but another floating rock in endless space that falls right alongside us. There is no stability in denial, no safety in oblivion. That notion is the opposite of comforting. It is downright terrifying, like the Shape. And it affects everything and everyone we ever know. No one can escape it. But what is even more terrifying than that is the idea of letting go, of accepting that there is no comfort, no security, nothing that will tell you you are safe, that entropy is not coming for you after all. Every fiber of your being rebels against this because that's the nature of an uncomfortable truth. It is, by definition, deeply uncomfortable, and it has to be, because you have been in deep, deep slumber. But when you reach that point where you finally do, where you not just understand, but fully, deeply accept that there is no safety, no reassurance, that we're always falling, and you go with it, then that which has been terrifying to the core all along reveals itself to be equally stunning, mesmerizing, and downright beautiful beyond measure. The beauty of existence does not contradict its terrors. Shadow and light go hand in hand. Nearly every little step in Cass's journey throughout the events of the game is struggle, suffering, and repeatedly, actively repressing the truth.
Stop thinking about it. Just stop thinking about it. Jesus. Right.
Every time Cass falls, we hold on actively. Cass and respectively the player must want to hold on and deliberately act to do it, holding on to the notion that there is still a chance that the Shape, i.e. entropy, can be eluded after all. Cass does not understand the Shape because he is by design not wired to. And like Sisyphus, he keeps rolling the boulder up the hill, clinging to the sliver of faith that makes him hold on. Remember what I said about the game being criticized for being repetitive? That the actions we engage in feel at times like we're doing the same thing over and over again, even though the outcome is disappointingly predetermined from the start.
Okay.
Starting to make some more sense now? But just like surviving is an active effort that requires agency, so is letting go. It is an action that requires an active choice and, in the game, an active user input. Once Cass reaches that moment of clarity, how they never had a chance, he decides to let go and finally wakes. That's what this is all about. The name of the fictitious corporation who owns the oil rig is Cadal, which is the Scottish Gaelic word for sleep. If we consider the game's title, Still Wakes the Deep, a quote from a poem by Craig Henry Campbell that's also featured in the game, it could very well just mean on that literal layer that evil, the Shape, the gooey entity, that's the thing that wakes, like from the deep, and we're fighting it. Yippee-ki-yay. But I really think the title refers to Cass, and by extension, through his very eyes, the players that are asleep. Cadal. Until they reach that point of cosmic epiphany that none of us, not Cass, not any of his crewmates, not any of us, ever came into this world. But that we always were, are, and are always going to be off this world. Just like a cell is the organism it is part of, just like a leaf is the tree it is part of, which is the earth it is part of, which is the universe we are all inseparable from. That is what the Shape is, a concept that's impossible to summarize into a single word. Death, entropy, oneness, Brahman, Tao. Let's not mince words here. The moment that sinks in, we realize that there is no need to fight, no need to struggle against the path everything follows. When deep inside of us, we finally stop being anxious about it and stop clinging and squeezing and finally let loose, we become still, calm. That's when we wake and remember that we were never separate from everything else, that this notion was always the biggest illusion of them all. There's only the path, so might as well enjoy it. Still Wakes the Deep is a Chinese room game, through and through. An overarching meta-narrative that blurs the line between reality, allegory, hallucination, memories, dreams, and blends it seamlessly into something so ephemeral that no interpretation is ever clear-cut. And it deliberately refrains from explaining what's really happening. By the end of the game, it's entirely possible that you have absolutely no clue what just happened. And that might frustrate you and lead you to toss the game aside and sneer at it and give it a bad review. Or it can lead you to let it simmer and come back to it and maybe one day overanalyze it like I just did, find your own interpretation and meaning, and then see the whole thing in a completely new light. And it's equally true and not even unlikely at all, and exceedingly wonderful that you can arrive at a completely different interpretation of the game's themes and events. But unlike games like Dear Esther or Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, it also serves a really succulent dish aside from that, because even if you ignore all these pretentious metaphysical allegory shenanigans, it's an incredibly competent, highly atmospheric, well-crafted, and well-presented narrative single-player horror experience. I had a fantastic time with it when I just took it plain and enjoyed it as a more than worthy successor to the tried and true defenseless protagonist first-person horror genre in the best tradition of classic Amnesia. But I pretty much quadrupled my enjoyment with it once I started going all galaxy brain on it. Is my reading on it the right one? I don't know, and I honestly don't give a shit. It's one that resonates with me on a deep emotional and spiritual level in a way that few games have managed so far, and in a way that directly reminds me of how important my reading of Dear Esther became for me, and how it elevated that game to something deeply personal for the rest of my life. So there you have it. To me, Still Wakes the Deep is the Chinese room's absurdist masterpiece. You know, before I let you go, while working on this video, I thought a lot about Amnesia: A Machine for Pigs, actually. As I mentioned earlier, I have felt for a long time that this game was really met with a rather skewed and frankly unfair assessment by audiences and critics at the time it came out. But seeing that people now are, after Still Wakes the Deep, that has put the Chinese room back on the map in the realm of first-person defenseless horror, starting to come around on Machine for Pigs, and giving it a long-deserved second look, this time far more on its own terms, it makes me excited. See, for a while, we had been planning to give the entire Amnesia series a big retrospective at some point in the near future on this channel. But the more I think about it, the more I feel like I want to specifically give A Machine for Pigs spotlight and a thorough reassessment in a standalone video. Because I have a lot to say about it, and maybe now's the perfect time. I'm not 100% decided on this, and I'm going to ruminate on that for a bit, but please feel absolutely free to tell me how you feel about this. Would you like me to cover that game, and if so, would you prefer it as part of a large retrospective or as a standalone piece? I'd love to hear your thoughts. This video took me way longer than I had initially anticipated. As I said, it was originally meant to be a short little review on this game, and now, 2 months later, it's far over an hour long, and we've literally arrived at explaining life, the universe, and everything. That, in and of itself, feels almost like it's satirizing my inability to keep my videos short. But what it also highlights is just how much work, effort, patience, and especially with this video, perseverance it takes to make these. Trust me, I felt several times during the making of this one like throwing it all away and starting something way simpler. If you had a good or an engaging time with this, and this is your first video of mine, hey, I'm Ragnar, and on my channel I largely cover old games, horror games, indie games, and combinations thereof. And I'd like to extend a big thank you to all the people who support the work on my channel on Patreon. So with this, I'm humbly asking for a pledge from anyone who would love to support my content and for whom a monthly donation over on my Patreon is financially feasible. I'm in the process of slowly extending my collection of backer-only videos. I call the format Ragnar Rambles, which gives me an outlet to produce all kinds of one-day production cycle videos on topics that I'd personally love to cover at some point, but that I haven't been able to fit into the usual upload routine of my channel. The last one that I just released is a very personal commentary on Morrowind, a game that I've been wanting to cover for many years, but never found the right approach so far. It might still happen for a public video, but this one, for now, exclusively focuses on my very personal reasons for why this game is one of the most important pieces of media in my life and how it, I promise this isn't clickbait, might have just saved my life at one point in my life. Thank you for considering to support me, and as always, a special thank you goes out to LSNHNG, Vincent Kavanaugh, Aurora Melpomene Crescendo, Sean H., Jordan Gertler, Link Hughes, Zodi, Dlebin, Chuck Taylor, Angelo Benedetti, Shannon Blue, Jin Hansen, Giselle, Thwagam, David Zelenak, Avian the Assassin, Laird Wakala, John Boring, Matt Gretton, Chrissy, Vasily Prokhorov, Casper Ram, Felix, Morgan K, Felix D, Adrian Kubiak, Hunter Crawford and Margaret Strawn, Kerry George, Ari Orson, Thomas Brunner, Lucas Ferreira Leite, Swiss Hackmod, Gehennas, Sable Cowell, Amber Wiggins, Kenan Ward, Billy Lott, Tabby, Isabella Stoner, Nathan Gillig, Corey Marr, Ronan Crom, aka Daniel242172, The Spiral Architect, 9ball 9606, Nikot the Brave, Sam Laurel, Uziel 1447, Dana Rosa, Sulmatul, Terraflops, Kyle Lee, Sunny Sky, Dr. Haley Isabella Colley, Catherine Escobar, and Lillen B. Until next time, ta-ta!